All right, we find ourselves on chapter 11 where we're going to be talking about biodiversity and conservation biology. So, the first lesson is about life's diversity on Earth. And so, we'll start by defining biodiversity, which is the variety of life across all levels of biological organization from genes through ecosystems. So, it's everything that makes anything different in regards to life on Earth. So, start big with ecosystems. So, how many different kinds of ecosystems are there across the planet, all the way down to genes. So genes are what make us different from others in our own species. So if you think about it, below genes would be the bases in the DNA. So adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine, and every living thing has those. But what makes us different from a banana or from a zebra or from a bacteria is the order in which they are found, and that's our genes. So we go from genes through ecosystems. We'll start by defining species. So a species is a set of organisms that share unique characteristics and can breed and produce fertile offspring. So species tend to look the same, they have the same number of limbs, they do the same, they have the same sort of lifestyle, and then they can also breed and produce fertile offspring. So species come from speciation events. So we talked about this in our natural selection chapter. When one species starts to diversify from another based on different selection pressures, we get two species, and they disappear through extinction. We also have what's called subspecies, where biodiversity also exists. So we just define species, but sometimes there are different groups within a species that maybe live in a different area or eat a different food source or look a little different or whatever it might be. And they're still classified as the same species, but they're just below, they're just a little bit different from each other. We call that a subspecies. So we would talk about species diversity as being the number or variety of species found in a region. So species richness describes the number of species found in a region. So how many different kinds of four-legged animals and plants and bacteria live in a region would be species diversity. We also talk about evenness or relative abundance, and this describes the different numbers of the numbers of individuals of each species. So in this picture, we can see a lot of zebras and a lot of plants, but only one giraffe. So that would be how we would classify evenness, is the number of individuals of each of them. So greater evenness means that the numbers are about even between them. Then we talk about genetic diversity, and genetic diversity includes differences in DNA among individuals. So that box has dropped down now to be these four of the same species. So they would talk about the differences in genes between the four, or the differences in genes among the individuals of one species. And genetic diversity is really important because individual or populations with little genetic diversity are more likely to suffer inbreeding depression, which is something that we'll probably talk about later, where basically they don't have enough genetic diversity to continue and they're just basically inbreeding, and will be vulnerable to environmental change as they lack the variance needed to adapt to new conditions. So this takes us back to that Darwin game we played, where we knew that in order to be able to survive, we needed to have a variety of different traits amongst our individuals. That way they could adapt to the new selection pressures and the new things that came about. So that would be why genetic diversity is important. Then we get to ecosystem diversity, which refers to the number and variety of ecosystems, community, or habitats. So within one region, how many different kinds of habitats, how many different kinds of communities are there to be found? So biodiversity is unevenly distributed across life. Some groups of organisms include more species than others. Insects, for example, are the most diverse groups of organisms. So we can see here that this is all life. Animals are 3/4 of that life, which is pretty crazy. There's 1.5 million animal species. Then we get over here, 1 million of those are insects. So two-thirds of all animals are insects. And then of that, 40% of insects are beetles. So they didn't show it on here, but if they broke this down further, 40% of this would be beetles. And there are more beetle species than all other non-insect animal and plant species. So all their animals and all plants, there's more beetles than all of those. So beetles are super, super diverse. Then you can see there's a lot of fish, more fish than mammals. So life is unevenly distributed. And basically the reason for that, or the reason why some species have been, or some groups of organisms have been more successful in diversifying and creating new species. So the beetles' large numbers of species formed rapidly as they spread and adapted to a new environment. So there's 3 reasons why that might happen. One would be that as one group spread to a new environment, they speciated rapidly and got new large numbers of species. The second would be that whatever species it is tends to be subdivided, like tends to have a barrier between them, so that new speciation events will happen and we'll get two new species. And the third one is that maybe this organism has been around for a very long time and they have low extinction rates. So just over time, they've evolved tons of new species. So those are the three reasons why there might be a ton of one kind of species versus another. And then biodiversity also varies based on location. So species richness generally increases as we approach the equator, a pattern called latitudinal gradient in species richness. Do you have a picture? Okay. So there are scientists have found it obvious but hard to explain, but there's 4 theories. So that's not a great map. Basically, as we move towards the equator, there's a ton more species. And one of them is that there's the tropics provide more room for speciation, so there's just more livable land area for speciation to occur. That's one of them. Another one is that there's more solar energy, which means that there's more net primary productivity, which means that we can move up the trophic levels easier. So there's just more energy and more food available for living things closer to the equator. Another one is that they're the stability of the tropical climate. So they're very stable. So since they're so stable, it allows for not just generalist species to survive, because remember that generalist species can survive under a lot of circumstances. So it allows for the generalist species, but then also for the specialist species that are going to eat one kind of nut or going to live under one kind of leaf, because they're very stable. So whatever their one thing they're depending on is likely to be there for a long time. And then the last one is lack of disruptive glaciation events. So as you move closer to the poles, there have been a repeated cycle of glaciers moving and receding and moving and receding, and that pushes people towards or away from the poles, because then they can't live there if there's glaciers there. So as we move towards the equator, we see much more species richness. And species diversity also tends to increase in areas with more diverse habitats, such as ecotones. If you remember back to ecotones, it's the areas between two ecosystems that have like overlap. So we tend to see a lot of species richness there. And structurally diverse habitats like forests also tend to be more biodiverse, because there's just more places for people to live there, or locations. So if you have a structurally diverse location, it's much more likely that you can have a lot of different kinds of organisms living there than if it's like the grassland. And so, so also with, so human disturbance, going back to the ecotones, human disturbance creates ecotones because we are messing with the ecosystems. And so moderately disturbed areas tend to have a higher species richness. So maybe humans have created a road through a grassland or something like that. That's creating an ecotone. And so now we are able to have a little bit more species diversity from a mild level of disturbance. But as we get into a lot of human disturbance, then we are decreasing diversity, because it replaces regionally unique habitats with homogenized disturbed habitats, causing any species dependent on the first natural one to disappear. So a moderate level of disturbance is good because it creates that diversity, the structural diversity and the ecotones that allow for living things to thrive and to have a high biodiversity. But the more disturbance will lead to homogenized, meaning all the same, and then it's hard to have species diversity there. And then the structurally diverse forests are going to be more diverse than grasslands, because there's just more different levels of places for species to live, and a coral reef is much more diverse than an open ocean, again for the same reason. And many species await discovery. So we've discovered about 1.8 million species of plant, animal, and microorganisms, but the estimates for that number range from 3 to 100,000. 3 to 100 million species, and we found 1.8. The accepted reasonable amount that they think we might ever find is 14 million. And the reason for this, the reason that we're so incomplete, is because most of the unknown species are really small, like bacteria, roundworms, fungi, and protists. And so it takes a lot of study to realize that they're different. It's not just like how you can tell a cat is different from a dog. It's down on a genetic basis. And then also, there are many organisms that appear to be the same species but are found to be different under further examination. So we've classified two types of bird always as being the same species, and then if we look a little deeper, we see that actually they are two different species. And then also we have still areas of the planet that haven't been discovered. Deep down in the bottom of the ocean hasn't really been discovered, so we expect to find more species in these types of areas.